One of the things that reading the archive for this book and writing this book did for me is it made me much more aware of the ways that fascist thinking runs through US history from the get-go, and it's kind of a current, and it flares up at different moments. I'm Julie Carr, and I'm the author of Mud, Blood, and Ghosts, Populism, Eugenics, and Spiritualism in the American West. My great-grandfather was named Omer Madison Kem, and he was a founding member of the Populist Party, which was a group of poor farmers in the Plain States and also in the South who formed a third party in opposition to what they saw as capitalist greed. And as a member of that party, he was elected to Congress in 1892, representing Nebraska. So since I grew up in a pretty progressive family, he was always a kind of hero to us. His story was something to be proud of. And when I started to read his autobiography, which he left behind, a 2,000-page manuscript, that's when I learned about some of the complexities and contradictions in that story. Omer was a supporter of women's rights and of birth control early on, and so were his daughters. And yet, if I had thought that the really radical roots of that birth control movement were attractive to him and to his daughters, I would have found myself disappointed. By the time he and one of his daughters, Iris, were writing letters back and forth about the birth control movement, that movement was firmly grafted onto the eugenics movement. I got a little obsessed with the young Margaret Sanger. I wanted her young self to outlive her older self somehow, but that's not really how it works. That's not how it works for any of us, and it wasn't how it works for members of my family as well. So she started her movement around 1912, her movement to legalize birth control and birth control information. She lived in New York City in Greenwich Village. At that point, she was an immigrant and workers' rights activist. She was a member of the Socialist Party. In 1912, she shifted from the Socialist Party to the IWW, or the Wobblies, which are an even more radical wing of the labor movement. And she saw birth control not just as a feminist issue, but also as an anti-capitalist strategy, with the idea that if there are fewer workers, wages will be better, and workers will be more powerful and more able to resist capitalist exploitation. In the 1920s, she started to open clinics, the first called the Clinical Research Bureau. There's a site on 16th Street now, which is a National Historic Landmark that was her clinic. In 1929, she opened the Harlem branch of the Clinical Research Bureau. This branch, she understood, wouldn't really be successful unless she had buy-in from the Black community in Harlem. So she created an advisory board, all Black leaders in Harlem. The 16th Street Clinic now is, in a sense, ironically, right next door to the Center for Jewish History. This is ironic because of the way in which her movement ended up aligning itself with, or even collaborating with, the eugenics movement. And the eugenics movement, of course, had a huge influence on Nazism, and therefore a huge influence on the Holocaust. So these two buildings being right next to each other speaks in a way, maybe in an unplanned way, about exactly that history. In the 1920s, Sanger starts to shift away from the really radical roots of her movement and aligns it instead with the growing and, at this point, quite mainstream eugenics movement in New York City. And one of the ways we can see that shift is in the fact that she organized her conference, the first conference on birth control that she organized, to happen just after the second annual International Conference on Eugenics, which was organized by Fairfield Osborn and Madison Grant. Fairfield Osborn was the president of the American Museum of Natural History, and Madison Grant was on the board. Madison Grant is probably the most notorious of the eugenicists. He wrote The Passing of the Great Race, which Hitler read when he was in prison and reportedly referred to as his Bible. They were vehemently racist, vehemently white supremacist, and anti-immigration. Historian James Whitman has documented how the Nazis, when they were writing their Nuremberg laws, were studying the Jim Crow laws in the United States. They were studying also the sterilization laws in the United States. In the early 30s, when the Nazis passed their sterilization law, which ended up sterilizing hundreds of thousands of German people, when this law becomes known in the United States, Margaret Sanger puts out a press release. And instead of damning the law, she semi-endorses it by saying that she considers it right that people who are, quote, feeble-minded or have heritable diseases should consent to be sterilized. Scholars have argued that Sanger's shift towards eugenics was merely strategic, that she needed to do this in order to bring her movement into the mainstream and away from the radical fringes. And perhaps that's true, but whatever the reasons, this shift is disappointing. And it's maybe perhaps worse than disappointing. It's a bitter feeling to confront that shift. My great-grandfather, Omer Kem, became enamored with the eugenics movement. He was obsessed with the promise of genetic breeding, and also with that, terrified of contamination, often expressed as racial contamination. And one of the people he wrote letters to was his daughter Iris, who was a farmer at that time in Colorado. She was receptive to his ideas. She gave speeches to her women's club in favor of birth control. But when you read those speeches, you can also see her moving towards a eugenic sort of point of view. If we can make laws to exclude undesirable people from the shores of our country, can we not make laws excluding the undesirable among the unborn? Who are these undesirables? They are the many children of impoverished mothers, the poor little disgusting mites who have just growed and whose influence is a menace to all other children, she writes. So it might not be clear, but I think the line about the disgusting little mites who are menacing all other children was meant as a joke. It's the kind of joke that people in my family might have made then. But it reveals an anxiety that she carries about immigrant children, about race, about poor children. And it's an anxiety about being menaced, but it's ironic, of course, because reproductive justice then and now is so unevenly distributed across class, across race, across citizenship. So I guess the question is, who really is being menaced and by whom? There aren't moments of fascism and moments of no fascism. There's just always a strain of fascist thinking. And by that I mean an ideology that believes that some people are genetically more worthy of property, more worthy of citizenship, more worthy of education, more worthy of money than others. And that those who are less worthy are, in its most extreme expressions, not even worthy of life itself. Reading this history from the 1870s to about the 1930s, I saw a lot of examples of what we can now call fascist thinking. There's a way in which we think of history as sort of back there and under there, but in fact it's informing everything that we do and who we are. And I think that when you do realize that, when it becomes more exposed and you start to see how your history as a person and our history as a nation is everywhere, you have to accept all of the complexities of that history as well. It becomes harder to mythologize.